Welcome to this session on Comics of the New Europe, which is a collection of articles about comics from East Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, former Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Ukraine. It is much easier, I think, to say New Europe. As I said, we have both editors and one of the participants here. So this has all been really great, and I'm going to open it up for questions, but first I want to take advantage of my role as moderator here to ask the first kind of broad question here, which comes from reading this book, hearing your presentations, and being a lifelong comics reader here in North America. Jose talked about how Barranco is preoccupied with alternate history, and one of the things that I get out of this stuff is I feel like I'm watching and I'm looking at the alternate history of comics themselves, right? Compared to what I've grown up in, and in particular, I look at all these comics from Comics of New Europe, and I have a reaction that I think is kind of obvious, but worth dwelling on for a second, that these comics seem really European. That is, it almost seems as they produced as if the heroic fantasy of North America and Japan, say Jack Kirby and Tezuka, never existed. And since you guys are giving us sort of the beginnings of a sense of the canon of these comics cultures that are unavailable to most of us, I was wondering if any of you could say something about what the role of these artists are, what the role of comics culture is in these countries, in what I assume is the absence of a large-scale, heroic, fantastic mainstream like we have in the two biggest comics cultures in North America and the United States. I mean, what kind of niche do these creators have in a comics culture that I presume is completely different and more arts comics focused than what we would take for granted, say in North America? If any of you would like to take a stab at that.
I could start.
I just wanted to say bye and thank you because I have to teach, unfortunately. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so
and
much.
I really wish I could
Great
participate in the questionnaire, but I hope I receive some emails after the fact. Take
Okay.
care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. All right, so the question is, these look much more like, well, I think they look much more like alternative, some of them look much more like alternative comics. So for example, in my graphic novel class, I'm gonna talk about Raw next time. And that's a very different trend, even in an American context, that really comes more out of fine art or popular art. The other thing I would say is maybe they're trying to react a little bit against the superhero comics hegemony and Franco-Belgian comics, and trying to do something that is both in dialogue, so different from that. And I think they do actually struggle to produce and make these comics financially viable. I mean, a lot of the chapters talk about how there was a boom and then a lot of these industries, these little publishing houses would close because they didn't have enough people buying them. And I think that part of the problem is they need to be translated into more languages, quite frankly, so they have a larger market. But I don't know, Jose, what would you like to add to that?
What's interesting from what you said is it sounds like that, of course, obviously American alternative comics do come to mind, but that these are kind of alternative comics, but they're an alternative to something that's not in their own country, but a foreign and hegemonic tradition. Jose, please, go ahead.
Jose, did you want to say something?
Are you?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. No, Elliot, I was saying that what you just said is maybe a little bit too much of a generalization, in that it really kind of depends on which country, and we have such differences between these countries. There's also different periods, right? A little bit, even though most of what we're examining in the book is closer to present day. And this was something Martha and I also discussed, like what period did we want to talk about, right? Because there were comics being published in Poland and even in Czechoslovakia, right, in the post-war period. So, I mean, but we're not examining them. Or even a series in Czechoslovakia, like Sterlistek was tremendously popular Obviously, it would be what you would consider a much more mainstream. It's kind of like children's comics. And some of the other chapters we did not consider today, like Mihaela Prekup's work on autobiographical comics in Romania, or Alexander Sekulich's work on Vostok in Serbia. Vostok, I think, is an interesting example, somebody who's clearly coming out of the alternative scene, even the underground scene, you could say, but also is working with imagery like Mickey Mouse, I think, in interesting ways, and other kind of corporate symbols. If I could share my screen again real quick, I can talk, I think, in the case of Ukraine again here. What I mentioned very briefly before is Dahopak, which is, I think, an interesting version of a superhero, right? That's very, very national, right? And very particular to Ukrainian culture. And as I mentioned in my caption here, it's really a kind of nationalistic project to bring a sense of Ukraine's history, Ukrainian culture, and the ways in which you can use this hyper-masculine image of the Cossack in all sorts of different events. I mean, they're superheroes, Elliot, just by another name, really. And so I think they are learning some of these lessons from what more kind of global trends in comics publishing from other countries. So I do think that in general, yes, we were focusing on material that does tend to, is very European, as you're saying, and that it is very much of their own traditions. But if one were to look maybe a little bit more broad, more widely, right, in any of these countries, I think you would find children's comics that are a little bit more like children's comics in the US. Maybe not superheroes, although as we know, Russia has its own successful superhero company, Bubble, which is sort of the Russian Marvel, and very much bills itself that way. So there's been other similar attempts in places like the Czech Republic and Poland. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a qualified yes.
Great.
So, can I just add one other thing? So Mashek and Baban, the two guys who did this Monster Cabaret series, which, by the way, was initially just something they did on the side while they were in film school, but turned into this really terrific project. There's a Radio Prague interview where they describe the character as an anti-superhero. And so they're kind of referring to that, but more in an ironic sense, like, let's turn it upside down. I also want to say that Damien with his trunk, initially that seems like a deformation, but the trunk turns out to be the way he defeats the evil General Chobot. So, even that notion of like what is grotesque, what is connotation as negative or positive, having a trunk turns out to be a good thing in the end of that story, which is also really, really great.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So Emily had a question in chat. Emily, would you like to ask it yourself? If so, Sasha, can you unmute her? Otherwise I can read it. But Emily, why don't you speak? Oh, good. There you are, Emily. So Sasha, will you unmute? There we go.
Thanks, everyone. I have a pretty banal question. I definitely will look for this volume and for the works that have already been published and translated in North America. But do any of you have any sites or stores that you would recommend for those of us who don't know where to find comics of the New Europe?
Aha! So I did send to Elliot and Sasha a link. We have a coupon code so that you can actually buy it. So it's distributed by Cornell University Press. And I don't know if Sasha can get that or if I should dig it up, but we'll answer that question.
But I think part of the question was also where you can find more comics, more actual primary sources from.
Right. That's harder. Yeah, that's harder. I don't know. I've heard that Forbidden Planet just closed in New York. Is that true?
What?
I think so. I mean, I haven't seen it for a while, I must admit. I think everything's closed. So
yeah, it's really depressing. I mean, that was a landmark when I was a teenager, Forbidden Planet, and that's where they had European comics. So I think mostly I have to get my comics through mail order, or when I was in Prague, I would buy them in person in bookstores. I know that doesn't help, but I think you have to find an independent comics store, you know, where you live. Otherwise, you buy them online. I don't know, Jose, what do you do?
Well, I can recommend one of the publishers that Martha mentioned that's doing the Maszek translation. That's Centrala. That is a Polish publisher, but they've had an office in London, and they've really been accelerating in the last few years their translations into English, which is wonderful. Even things that are not Polish. So I would look at their site, and I'm most conversant with the stuff available in Russia. Comixology has some Russian stuff available. It's more mainstream, like Bubble and similar things like that. But if you really want to, especially if you read Russian, I would recommend the website of Boom Kniga, which is the leading alternative comics press. They've done remarkable, wonderful work over the last 10 years, translating a lot of stuff from basically, you know, global comics heritage into Russian, things like Persepolis, things like Epileptic by David B., and a lot of stuff. Tilly Walden, they've translated. So there's a lot of, as well as a lot of native Russian material, but they don't do it in translation. They do it in Russian.
You know, one of the things that I've been frustrated by, actually, like when I go to their site and look, when I read your work and find out more Russian comics and go look for them, is how sort of surprising, given the way that texts circulate in Russia, at least, how little of this is available digitally, which is unfortunate given the access questions. Is this primarily a fear of piracy?
You know, I think partly it's been a lot of, speaking of precarity, a lot of anxiety on the part of Russian publishers up until recently. Yes, partly piracy, but partly also just the sense that there is that Russian comics are not really a sure proposition yet. And I think that that's translated into a lot of caution. The other thing I was going to say for the questioner is that if another possibility is if a lot of the stuff is not been translated into English, but it is in French. So a number of material, including Maszek, including a lot of Russian stuff, actually has made it into the French market. So if you can read French, you can access it that way.
The French translate everything. It's the same with the literature from the region too. If you can read French, you have a gateway to the world.
Yeah, and this was also, speaking of translation, it was another really perennial problem that Martha and I have also, I think, mentioned at conferences like the Comic Studies Society conference, the last one that was held in person in Toronto, where there was a wonderful talk by Nina Mikwitz, a British comics scholar, kind of really bemoaning the fact that we talk about the transnational turn, we talk about the importance of kind of getting everybody, to see this wonderful material, but there's just such a paucity of translations. Yeah. And then I myself have been trying, I was on sabbatical last year, and I did my due diligence. I brought 3 projects, 3 important Russian comics works to a number of publishers, and they all just, didn't give a damn. So it's hard to, I always said, I'll do it for free. I'm happy to do it. And some really major works that people should be reading, but including one of them that I call The Russian Mouse, Survilo by Olga Lavrentieva. But and that just came out a few months ago in French. So I'm just really just angry about that, really. And I know, Martha, you've had similar. I had the same.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I think, we need to find a special publishing house that will do more, I don't know, academic translations. I'm not sure. It's a real problem. I agree.
Or maybe a digital route might be more, if you're willing to do it for free, might be more possible.
Yeah. So maybe under the Jordan Center imprint, Elliot.
I was going to say, you guys set up a publishing company, the Comics of the New Europe Publishing Company. I want to point out in the chat that Ala Roylance writes that Ohio State and UC San Diego have great collections of graphic novels from many countries, and NYU has also started buying graphic novels from Russia, Poland, and the Czech Republic. So the library system, interlibrary loan, can be a really good way of finding these works, assuming you can actually read them, which is always the big issue here. So there was a question in the chat from Teo. Teo, would you like to ask your question yourself? Sasha, will you ask Teo to unmute?
Sure.
I think
Okay.
Teo's on screen.
There we go.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm actually calling by invitation from Biz, and I'm calling from Finland, so it's like after midnight here. But yeah, I came to the event just because I'm currently writing my MA thesis about like Balkan immigration from the perspective of comics, and I was actually like interested, like if you've come across like any more prominent academic works, kind of like combining those two fields, like Balkan studies or like Balkans and comics in some sort of way. I know it's not exactly part of the scope of the book, but you also had like countries like Yugoslavia and Romania, which are part of the region. But yeah, that's kind of like what I was wondering.
I can recommend one of our contributors is Michaela Prikup of Romania, and she's written both in our volume, but then also she's had a few other articles here and there. So I would follow up with some of that, and she's doing some fabulous work. Although her one book that she's put out is not about Romanian comics. It's about, I believe, American and European. But she's great. The work, probably Alexander Zograf is the former Yugoslav comics author that's had the most exposure and the most written about him. So I would look at some of the articles like that that have already been done on him, as well as our material. But yeah, I'm not too certain beyond that myself. If anybody knows of others.
So Jose, is there a Balkan comics study group, or I'm probably confusing that with a different one. There's a Scandinavian comics study group. You were involved in some group with Biz. I can't remember, what was that called?
From what I remember, it was something that it was a website that was trying to put together scholarship generally from the area, but I don't recall too much there about the Balkans.
Okay.
There's one other person from Bulgaria that I'm forgetting that also maybe wrote something about this, but I can connect with you if you want to email me, Teo. You can.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Yeah, I'm Bulgarian as well, so it's going to be quite. I'm Bulgarian as well, so it's going to be quite easy to talk with that person.
Okay, so that person might have. I forget who it was.
What is the best way that I can get in contact with you? Like,
you can just write down my name, Hose Alaniz 23@gmail.com.
Okay, perfect.
Let me write it in the chat.
Yeah, great. So this isn't quite the level of scholarship, but where I tend to find like little pieces here and there written about comics in the Balkans and Eastern Europe and elsewhere is occasionally through links on tcj.com, the Comics Journal, and occasionally little small features on, say, Calvert Journal. But it's very sparse.
Yeah, I've noticed. There's not much overall.
Yeah. In the chat.
And look at the bibliography in our book as well.
Yeah, perfect. Great, thank you.
In the chat, Karen Green writes, Columbia University also has a substantial collection. This is a classic NYU Columbia moment. Also has a substantial collection. NYU Slavic librarian consulted with us when she started their collection. So, so both places and Interlibrary Loan are good places to go looking for things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question or comment they would like to make about the comics of the New Europe? Well, in that case, we have remarkably fit in the time frame that we designated here since it's 6:13. So I would just like to thank Jose and Martha and Biz, who's not here, and everybody really for attending this fantastic presentation. I encourage you all to go out and find this book, buy this book, tell other people to read the book, and find those comics that you can read, or as I think Emily put in the chat, just look through the pictures. I mean, that's the stereotype, right? Why not go with it? Just read the pictures because there's a wealth of material out there for you. So thank you again for letting us know a little bit about this comics world that is so unknown to most of us.
Thanks so much,
and
Elliot.
thank you again to the.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot, the Jordan Center, and thank you, Martha, for lighting the spark.
Right on.